When I attended the Harlem Book Fair a couple of years ago, I learned something about the impact of white supremacy on the black imagination. And what I learned was how deeply ingrained white supremacy is on the mind of African Americans in the African American community. At the book fair, I was presenting my one of my books, ISIS, to the audience, and a lot of people didn't really want to believe. They wouldn't suspend their disbelief and believe that Osiris could have a daughter, and that it was possible to make derivative stories from the Egyptian mythology. A lot of people, it was really disturbing to me that they could not imagine black gods, black mythology, or you know anything in a fantasy setting. They couldn't imagine it. However, the same African Americans could go out to the toy store, Toys R Us, and go buy toys for things like Monster High and Harry Potter, which feature, again, characters who like vampires who are undead and believe they can have children. They can't, and it was really interesting to me to show the impact of white supremacy because here it is, the white owned company produces a concept which features fantasy characters which cannot biologically have children. And then I present a concept which features a black god having a child with a woman, which is biologically possible. And even if you suspend your disbelief, it could actually happen. But this shows the impact of white supremacy on the mind of an African American. And I say that because it's just very interesting to me to show you the how deep this goes into the imagination of African Americans and some of us, and how why we can't really see ourselves in stories like African American fantasy or science fiction. We can't see ourselves in them. And then there were other people who were trying to interject reality into it, talking about how I was promoting the worship of pagan gods and pagan religion when these same black people will go out and they will read Harry Potter again, which is actually pagan worship, which features pagan concepts and non-religious, non-Christian concepts. They will also go in, and then there's also again going back to Monster High, also which features pagan and concepts, occult concepts. Harry Potter, which features occult concepts, like I said before, and they'll buy these products without question. However, when the African American man produces a concept like I did with ISIS, which features Egyptian gods, Egyptian mythology, all of a sudden they want to approach me with a Christian cross and shaming tactics in an attempt to say that there's something wrong with this. But on the flip side, when it's produced by a non-black person, when it's produced by a white person, these same African Americans will go out and buy that exact same product, like with no problem. It clearly shows me how white supremacy has affected the imagination of African Americans in America. And another example I'll give you, featuring ISIS again, daughter of Osiris, Egyptian mythology, African American fantasy, also goes with the comic book character Thor. Again, they'll tell me that my concept is all wrong and that it's pagan, but then your kids are reading what just got through watching Thor movies, the Avengers, and they all feature a character based on a Norse god and Norse mythology. Again, another pagan concept. But this is acceptable because the character is white and is produced by a white company. And and again, not questioning it at all. Not questioning it at all. No questions whatsoever. No challenge. No, I'm not going to bring this into my home. No, this is not offensive. this is offensive, no protests at all. And all these characters were all seen as part of mainstream American culture. However, when I present a fantasy concept, like ISIS or the ISIS series to many African Americans, some of them want to question it, some of them want to inject reality into it, and they can't suspend their disbelief. And as I see it, it shows me the tremendous impact of white supremacy on the African American imagination and still on the African American mind. Um, and what I've been finding in writing this 12 years is that this double standard has been around for quite some time. I like to call it selective imagination. It's like an outward conditioning of institutional racism. Um, what I find is when there's an image of a white person in fantasy, like a Captain Kirk, they'll believe it. And if it's something produced with a black character like Ben Sisko in a fantasy setting, and because it's produced by white people, they'll believe it. However, if a producer of black fantasy content comes to an African American, there are a lot of questions, and then they don't want to believe the fantasy that is transpiring in front of them, or they don't want to even think about imagining a world where blacks created it, an imaginary world created by blacks for blacks. Um, and they have a hard time immersing themselves into that fantasy. They have a hard time immersing themselves into the world that's being built. They want to interject some type of real world concept into it. They want to try to interject some type of real world logic into it. And I really think that this is one of the reasons why black people have a hard time imagining themselves in a world outside of the ghetto. Because sometimes I wonder, does it hurt too much to think about what could be? Or are black people afraid just to see themselves outside of the limitations imposed on them by white supremacy? And I sometimes wonder how deep this mental enslavement is, and if it reaches deep into the subconscious of black people, that white supremacy controls their very imaginations. I mean, it's just interesting to me because most fantasy and science fiction always features a white male in the lead, and it's always created and produced by white males. And you never ever see I mean, not never, but rarely ever see a black person in the lead, and you never ever see a black person creating the content for black people and featuring black people in the lead roles. And even in most of the things like Star Trek and all that, Star Wars and all that stuff, you always see the white males in control, and you even see the aliens submitting to the white male, and that shows you how deep white supremacy is in fantasy and science fiction, and how deep it is in the culture, in this pop culture concepts like that, and all of it shows you that there's for all of the so-called diversity in fantasy and science fiction, we rarely see anybody behind the scenes up front that's an African American, creating the stories and presenting the stories to you. And because we don't get that black perspective in the mainstream, it's not good for us because we need to see a place for ourselves in the future. We need to see a place for ourselves in the past. And because when you see a place for yourself in an imaginary world, you can see a place for yourself in the real world. And it's it affects how you think, and it affects how you see yourself, because if all you see is a ghetto and all you see is the inner city, and all you see is that type of life, you can't see yourself coming out of it. One of the things I try to do is create world when I'm doing the ISIS series, and when I also do other books like the East series, and starting to work on John Haynes again, is I try to imagine what could be so that others can see what a possible future can be. Really, I want black people to start seeing themselves as they are and start defining their own image. And that was one of the things. That's one of the reasons why I like to write fantasy and science fiction. And because I want people to see what they could possibly be and start to take control of their own image and to start seeing themselves as they are. Because we have to start defining our own image and just taking control. I mean, what we have to start doing is taking control of our own image and start defining who we are and not let other people tell us. Because this what I saw at the book fair, because it showed me the deep impact of white supremacy on the imagination of African Americans. The fact that black people could not suspend their disbelief and believe that there could be fantasy concepts featuring black people, or they tried to interject reality, their own personal reality, into the lives of the characters. Because I've done this when I've also had beta readers read some of my books. The same thing. They would start interjecting their own reality into the fantasy, and they would start projecting their own issues onto the characters, and they could not suspend their disbelief and just enjoy the story. And one of them, and some of them would just get so upset that they couldn't fit their reality into the fantasy that they would just lose it. I mean, I've run into people who just would get upset, literally get upset because they could not fit their personal experiences into the characters and into the story. They couldn't inject their ideas into the fantasy story. I mean, what I find, because I have not just black readers, but I also have non-black readers. I have white readers and foreign readers, and they can enjoy the fantasy. They can sit back and let the imaginary world they're immersed in, and they can be a part of it, and they don't have to interject any logic or reality into it, and they don't have to ask questions. Because they see everything explained to them clearly. They just enjoy the fantasy. They just enjoy the experience, and they get into the story and they enjoy the story. But with a lot of African Americans, because white supremacy has affected their imaginations, they can't really imagine anything like this. They can't imagine the world that I'm trying to create or the situations I'm putting the characters in. They can't see it as something to just enjoy. They want to put reality in all of the fiction, not knowing the fiction is made up. And the whole point of fiction is to imagine what could be, not what is right now. And it's a big problem with African Americans. I know a lot of African Americans, have issues and problems like racism and stuff like that. But the whole point of having an imagination is to see what can be so that you can create it and turn it into what could turn your world into what is. When you can see something in your mind, you can eventually imagine it and then start taking steps towards making it into your reality. And this is a big problem for African Americans. And I, it's really keeping the genre of African American fantasy and science fiction, speculative fiction, as some people call it, from really growing and being the next big genre for African Americans. And I really wanted to see more African Americans start to look at the long term impact of white supremacy on their imaginations, because it really is holding us back in some way. I believe it's really holding us back completely and preventing us from growing and becoming what we could be, because we keep seeing ourselves as what is right now, or some cases what was before, because a lot of people still hold on to slavery, still hold on to Jim Crow, and they start getting scared when things like the election of Barack Obama happen. They start getting scared, and then they start regressing instead of building on the progress and working towards taking themselves towards the next level. And it's a big problem with African Americans in fantasy. I really am trying to work hard towards helping African Americans understand this impact of white supremacy on the black imagination. It's a topic I really wanted. I wrote about it in a blog about a year ago, and I felt I'd make a video about it so that people can see a face of one of the people trying to work behind the scenes to help people understand this impact that white supremacy has on the African American mind, the African American psyche, and how it affects us in everyday ways that we don't see. And long term, we really need to do something about this because it's affecting us in ways we don't we just have to examine ourselves, take that deep self examination, take a look at that, and take ourselves and really start building towards taking control of our, because it all relates to our image and how we see ourselves, because we see ourselves the way white supremacists see us. We don't see ourselves as we actually are. When we look in the mirror, we have to start seeing ourselves as we actually are. If we're going to start making progress for the future and start building towards a future where we see ourselves in it. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, subscribe.